I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Robin Nusslock. He's a neuroscientist and associate professor of psychology at Northwestern University. Dr. Nusslock is an expert on the interactions between the brain and the immune system, including the role of neuroinflammation in positive emotion, negative emotion, and mental health. Robin, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I did some research into your academic work on the brain's interaction with the immune system and emotions and mental health. And then there was this side set of interests on mindfulness and doing neuroimaging studies on Tibetan monks and looking at interactions between this monastic life. And it's such an interesting parallel. As you mentioned, it's like different methods for studying the mind, but there's a neat intersection which I'd love to explore.
Would love to. Would love to discuss all those topics.
But one of the first things that came to mind there for me is when you think of the routine in a monastic lifestyle and perhaps even the diet, like we hear a lot about diet and inflammation, and there's research from labs such as yours that are now studying how that impacts the brain and impacts mental health. And it made me think, could one of the reasons that you see this increased mindfulness practice in monks simply be because of the routine or maybe even a cleaner diet? So it has lower inflammation and that just makes it easier. And then when you're in more of a chaotic world and having this Western diet with a lot of foods that weren't present in ancestral environments that could increase inflammation, that's one of the things that could contribute to mental health problems that we see rising today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's many ways to approach that. The first is just to highlight the fact that I think there's a growing recognition of the importance of whole person health and recognizing that if we're going to study the mind, we should obviously also appreciate the importance of studying the brain. But if we're going to study the brain, we need to recognize that the brain is embodied in a body, and that there are, historically, science and medicine have carved organ systems up into these distinct entities, assuming that these entities kind of operate in isolation of each other. And I think what we're really recognizing is that these organ systems are dynamically relating and communicating with each other in ways that actually co-regulate or co-dysregulate each other. And two organ systems that clearly have important bidirectional signaling pathways are the brain and the immune system. We know, there are established mechanisms to which the brain can modulate the immune system under conditions of threat. Sympathetic neurons descend from the brain and synapse or connect to on immune cells, developing immune cells in the bone marrow and the thymus and the spleen, and can nudge those cells towards inflammation, as you alluded to. And we also know that inflammatory proteins and cells in the body can access and or modulate activity in the brain. And all of this is extremely adaptive when regulated. But under conditions of chronic adversity or stress, these systems can become dysregulated in a way that they kind of co-amplify each other, such that the stress in the brain can disrupt the body and stress in the body can disrupt the brain. And so, you asked about, could this be related to some of the health problems that we see in our country? And absolutely. We have, high levels of stress, high levels of obesity. The U.S. Spends more money on healthcare than any other, basically country, and yet we have very low to moderate health outcomes. So I think these brain-body pathways are important. In terms of the work that we're doing with Tibetan Buddhist monastics in India, you also raised an interesting question about could lifestyle and diet be important in promoting, mental and physical health? And I would absolutely agree, but I'd also flip it in a way that in our work in India, one of the things that we're seeing is that there's an increase in kind of an ultra-processed food diet happening in the monastic communities because shops are opening up around the monasteries that are selling Doritos and sodas and various things like that. And so ironically and sadly, there's a growing increase in heart and diabetic and cardiometabolic health problems in the monastic community. So one of the studies that we're involved in is actually to look at diet changes and fasting and kind of, caloric modulation on the health of the monastics, because just highlighting again the important role that diet and whole person health can play in mental and physical health.
I had a old roommate who was Orthodox and he would do these extended fasts for Lent. But it was interesting because the things that are officially prohibited, they don't have Doritos back then. So he's still eating these hyper processed foods. And I was just thinking, that's interesting. Is this a loophole? Like the fact that now you have so many of these new tasty foods that are maybe going against the spirit of the fast, but they're not written into the law, so you can get away with it.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And I think a lot of it's accessibility, and a lot of it's that, foods are designed to really, these types of foods are designed to grab onto our reward circuits in the brain, and we love them. And we didn't necessarily evolve to eat those foods, but now they're available to us, and it's really hard to put on the executive control brake pad, and not, get into them too deeply. The fasting literature is interesting. There's a recent study that came out, I think in the New England Journal of Medicine, to suggest maybe it's not so much fasting as it is just being really mindful of caloric intake, and that's what has the body effects. But what we're really interested in my lab is also how those changes to the body actually affect the brain, and how changes to the brain affect the body, and really trying to take more of a systems perspective, not only on physical health, but also mental health. And so some of our recent work is actually looking at how heightened inflammation in the periphery can actually modulate brain systems that are implicated in depression and anxiety and various other types of mental health problems, to really understand this kind of whole person perspective of mental and physical health.
I gain more appreciation for this idea of treating the brain as a whole system interacting with the body through this puberty and hormones research that I was telling you about. So you know my current advisor, Leah Somerville, your old friends from college. Before that, you might know Megan Herting as well. She was
Mm.
my advisor at USC, and we were doing research again on puberty, hormones, and brain development. And through that lens, I started to learn more about endocrinology and treating the brain as like one of many organs within the endocrine system. And now she's doing cool research on air pollution and how different environmental toxins and also things through diet can serve as endocrine disruptors. And in this really roundabout way, end up influencing the brain or influencing mental health. I still know very, very little about the immune system, but that was an interesting parallel. And my interview with Megan, one of the first podcasts I ever did, we talked about this idea that why is neuroscience sexy? And it seems to stand out and get more attention compared to other biological sciences. And there's a lot of focus on the brain, which is great because now we can probe this more scientific understanding and not just treat things like addiction as simply fault of choice, but look at it in more of a medicalized way. But something about that, maybe it's this intrinsic dualism that we have. Once the brain becomes the seat of the mind, all the attention goes to the brain, and sometimes its interactions with the rest of the body are neglected.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so many interesting thoughts there. I think that, first of all, the endocrine system is fascinating. It plays an important role in regulating the immune system. So hormones like cortisol, are down regulators of inflammation in the short term, but under conditions of chronic stress, those same hormones can become pro-inflammatory. And so it really highlights the dynamic intersection between immunological processes and endocrine processes and neural processes. You speak to adolescence. A lot of our work right now is focusing on adolescence, as a really important risk period for the onset of mental health problems. This has been well established. Your advisor Leah Somerville is doing, I think, some of the best work in the world on this as it pertains to the kind of neurodevelopmental arc during adolescence that can generate risk for mental health problems. And one of the things that's interesting is that brain regions like the amygdala have androgen receptors that are receptive to changes in gonadal hormones that are obviously affecting the development of the brain during that very sensitive time period. And so it highlights the fact that, if we're gonna think about what are generating risk factors for complex outcomes, mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes, psychiatric health outcomes, we need to recognize that it's ultimately going to be a multi-systems perspective that's going to interact with each other in a complex way. And that involves, the brain, that involves the body, that involves endocrine, that involves immune. But equally, if not more important from my perspective, that involves the environment, that involves culture, that involves inequities in society, that involves kind of a sociological perspective in many ways of how is it that, inequities in society and life experiences embed themselves in biology. And so I think, you know, neuroscience and biology for me has actually taught me more about the important role that the environment plays in turning on and turning off and modulating these biological systems, as opposed to kind of a deterministic, your biology determines your outcomes. I think it actually is a very optimistic story in the sense that it gives us many degrees of freedom to appreciate that we can change our own biology through changing our behaviors. And I've learned a lot of that through our work in India with our dear Tibetan Buddhist colleagues and friends.
So even though we're seeing more and more neuroscience within psychology research and more systems biology applied to neuroscience research, it's still fairly rare. And I'm wondering how you came to this route. Was it more of a traditional psychology background and then getting deeper and deeper into the neurobiology over time, or did?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question, and I think part of it's just my constitution. I'm tend to be more of a systems thinker, and am interested in kind of the connection threads between the big and the small, and but also it really has emerged for me through my dear collaboration with and with a very dear friend of mine, Greg Miller, who studies how environmental experiences embed themselves in biology in such an incredibly provocative and inspiring way. And I think he's really been a huge influence on me on appreciating the threads between the macro systems. And I'm talking about systems out of the body. I'm talking about social systems and then how those affect, organ systems in the body. And also I've had the privilege of being a part of a policy institute at Northwestern called the Institute for Policy and Research, IPR. And you'd say, well, why is somebody who's interested in the brain and biology of human behavior and emotion a part of a policy institute? And it's actually because of, my recognition of the intersection between, social processes and cultural processes and how those affect biology. That's been very influenced by my involvement in this Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern, where sociologists and anthropologists and political scientists and economists and biologists and neuroscientists all come together and look for the points of intersection in each other's work rather than kind of, staying in traditional silos of academia that are more focused on carving nature, I think, at somewhat false joints. And I really think we're at a point where there's a recognition that we can come to complex issues from multiple different angles and generate a more comprehensive understanding of those issues.
I've gotten interested in science policy as well recently, and it's interesting to me how often it turns into this philosophical is versus ought problem because the
Mhm.
science tells you the descriptive is, and then maybe you can do different types of interventions and get more of an ought from there, but you still have to have some assumptions of, say, what you're trying to maximize in terms of health outcomes or other societal outcomes with what constrained resources. So, for example, you think about the role of maternal stress or diet on brain development. And then you could imagine this pool of government resources where it's like, we're going to have these downstream societal benefits if we invest in this, but how much do you invest? How much is appropriate? And how do you figure out what is the sort of optimal versus at what point you're just throwing money at a problem based on some lab rat studies and you're not exactly sure when it's going to generalize?
I think that's such a great point, and I think it highlights the importance of evidence-based policy, right? And I think it also highlights the importance of evidence-based policy across multiple different domains. I am a huge supporter and engager of animal models of mental and physical health. I mean, many, if not most, I think something like 90% of the Nobel Prizes in physiology have been based on work at the cellular level in animal work, and they've translated into extraordinary benefits in medicine and treating disease and illness. However, in our field of psychology and neuroscience and mental health, it's been very difficult to translate a lot of animal models into human models because we're really going many different scales from an animal brain to a human brain. And the human brain and its intersection with culture and environment is really complex. And so I think your point really highlights the need to come to evidence-based conclusions about issues and its translation into policy from multiple different perspectives and multiple different vantage points. And recognizing that each level of analysis is critical, but each level of analysis in isolation of itself may be overly simplistic.
Right. Another one of these philosophical problems that comes in, it's just day-to-day living, which is almost like a policy dilemma itself. And earlier you mentioned caloric restriction, and there's great animal studies that show that this can actually improve longevity. But then you think about what that would mean to implement that in your life. I mean, forgetting about the necessary discipline that it would take, even if you had the discipline, you're thinking you ate at 80% the calories that you normally eat, enough to survive, but more that it kicks on these types of anti-aging epigenetic effects, and it improves your longevity, but you're a little bit hungry all the time. Are you hangry? Is your quality of life worse? And then it turns into that dilemma of, quality over quantity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think it also highlights the fact that, changing momentum and changing psychology and biology is really hard. People use the phrase neuroplasticity, and people think, a lot of people think neuroplasticity is fundamentally good. Neuroplasticity just means that the brain changes in response to experience. And, we see neuroplastic changes within a day at, receptor variations on postsynaptic membranes and neurons, and across months to years to decades at structural, organ levels, the health of the body and brain. Um, and if we make wise decisions, we're going to have positive neuroplastic changes, and if we make not so wise decisions, we're going to have negative neuroplastic changes. And one of the negative kind of neuroplastic changes that we can see is the establishment of habits that really are hard to break. Those habits can be based on food, they can be based on behaviors that are pro-inflammatory and or not anti-inflammatory, like not exercising. And they can also be based on mental processes like just chronic stress and kind of the whole world of rumination that we all engage in and that certain people are really prone to, who are at risk for depression and anxiety. And so I think we need to have a lot of compassion for ourselves, for our families, our friends, and for society, and recognizing how hard it is to move the needle on changing behaviors and patterns in our brains and bodies, and how heroic it is to really take control and take charge of one's own path.
Robin, have you heard of Jocko Willink or David Goggins?
I have not. Oh, yes, I've heard of David Goggins, who I think my memory is that he was, if I'm correct, was a kind of a Marine at some point who was overweight and kind of became an internal Stoic philosopher and turned
Right.
himself to a super person, it seems like.
Right. Navy SEAL, super person, motivational speaker, and
Exactly.
Jocko's kind of the same.
Oh yeah, and
I think he was.
I know now. Yeah, Jocko is a Navy SEAL. I've seen interviews with him. He's I both, I now know, remember Jocko. He's a Navy SEAL who does a lot of motivational speaking, if my memory is correct.
Right. So both of their philosophy, it's like get up earlier, push yourself harder, you can do it. Your mind is your greatest weapon. It's all discipline. This is going to turn you into the better person. And it's this interesting paradox against what we're looking at with regard to this research on stress and neuroinflammation and well-being, because their philosophy is essentially what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
And the more you push through stress, the more cumulative stress you experience, it's like it raises your threshold, your tolerance for it. But then you look at the biological models of stress, and the message seems to be more like, well, it's bad, and it actually makes it less likely that you'll be able to have that sort of discipline and healthy choices, because a little bit of stress gives you a little bit of inflammation, which is going to, heighten your negative emotion just a little bit and impair your cognitive control just a little bit. And those things for me are hard to reconcile. I'd love to know how you think about them.
Oh, such an interesting question and perspective. Um, I think there's truths on all perspectives. So the first thing I would say about David Noggins, if I'm pronouncing his name right, and Jocko, is there is a beauty to that perspective in the sense that um, what they're what they're providing and offering is an invitation to choose a different response, to have the freedom to make a different response to the momentum of and the inertia of always choosing the easiest kind of let's just sit on the couch or let's take the easy path or what have you. I mean, they're really inspirational in the sense of saying that we have, to tread into complicated waters, more free will in choosing our behaviors than we perhaps think. Um, the challenge I feel with that very, very, very stoic kind of, philosophical model is that it also lacks, and it feels like it lacks a warm-heartedness and a bit of an emotive expansiveness, where it's all about the glorification of the statue of the self. And one of the things that I've really come to be so touched by is in spending time with Tibetan Buddhist monastics in India, the self is not the glorification, priority. It's the other. It's the focus on helping. It's the focusing on service. And I will say in my work in India, these are incredibly disciplined people. They're sleeping 5 or 6 hours a day. They're working 15, 14 hours a day in their studies and their practice. But there's almost an absence of self. The focus is on how do you help the planet. And so I think, tying those two threads together and taking the benefits and positives of both of them, there's a beautiful confluence between the David Noggins and the Jocko, perspective of you have a lot of freedom over your life, maybe more than you think, to make different choices. And then maybe like more of an Indo-Tibetan perspective saying, but you can also make those choices in the service of other people and compassion. And when those two roads meet, I think there's a potential magic there.
Hmm. That's beautiful. Now, even with the monastic idea, what stood out to me there is 5 to 6 hours of sleep. And there's all this great neuroscience research on the importance of sleep, on regulating your emotions and for just physiological well-being in general. And so with both of them, whether it's all of your effort devoted towards self or to other, I'm thinking, isn't that draining? And in a way that could be physiologically draining, like just stress wise, that could impair your long-term ability to even give back to the other. Now, what you're describing sounds like a stable routine and really just a culture built around this type of work ethic. But again, it seems to almost contradict what the neuroscience research that we hear about, or the medical research we hear about the importance of sleep. So what is going on there?
Yeah. Per usual, there's complexity. One of the things that's interesting about the monastic community is my experience is that they'll go to they often do late night debates, and I'm particularly talking in this specific tradition of Tibetan Buddhism that's called the Gelug tradition, which is the tradition of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And they'll do debates until 11 o'clock at night. So often the debate halls and the debate, courtyards are vibrant until 11 or 11:30. And then people are up at 5 or 6 in the morning. But then this particular community will take an hour or so nap or 2 hour nap in the afternoon. So they've kind of entrained themselves for this pathway of getting a fair amount of sleep, but kind of doing it in a way where they'll often take naps in the afternoon. And so there's often a 2 to 3 hour break in the afternoon when we're over there working and collaborating and teaching, where people will take naps. I think, on the point of sleep, there's a really growing, if not substantial amount of evidence to highlight the important role of sleep in mental and physical health. A few, just kind of critical points on that. We've been talking about inflammation. Deep sleep is a stage where the immune system does important remodeling. And that's a critical point of immunological healing and remodeling is during sleep. Actually, if you do look at these sleep deprivation studies that have been done back in the past, the way an organism might die from sleep loss is actually from infection, because essentially what happens is that the immune system falls apart if it doesn't have the ability to sleep. Um, in the brain, we know that sleep is critical for, lymphatic processes of drainage and cleaning. It's important for, microglial cells, which are the brain's immune cells, for doing important functions. And critically, it's important for memory consolidation. So it's actually during, deep sleep, stage 3, stage 4, where memory consolidation is, going through critical processes. And so, I think it's well established that sleep is a critical, if not primary, variable for mental and physical health. I think one of the risks that we run in whole person health is to turn whole person health into a striving game, where it becomes it becomes an achievement course. And this is one of my struggles sometimes in the mindfulness research world, which is like it turns into, I did this retreat and it increased my hippocampal neurogenesis and reduced my inflammation. And it becomes very Americanized in a way. And I think, part of her whole person health is to realize that even the best intentions of whole person health can turn into yet another kind of badge of honor of how little I slept and how many hours I meditated and how far I ran. And it kind of defeats the purpose in ways that I think you're alluding to.
Have you heard of Brian Johnson?
I don't know if I have. Cue me and I'll see if it triggers a memory.
Billionaire co-founder of Venmo that's doing all of that sort of health optimization. And his philosophy is see if we can defeat death. Now, taking all of the latest medical research to the extreme of doing basically every physiological test that you can imagine, like constantly updating his diet based on whatever his biomarkers are telling him. This whole team of medical researchers who are just tailoring this unique health outcome to him. And it's really just see how long he can live, see how much he can optimize health. Now, to the point that it's become his own life, his whole life. And it's an interesting case study to see this played out on the world stage, especially compared to I think more of like the monastic tradition that you're alluding to, where the focus should be all about other. And I don't exactly know the Buddhist philosophy on death, but really just every culture worldwide is going to have some philosophy of death and see it as this part of the natural cycle of life. And it's interesting that probably for the first time in human history, we're seriously thinking about, is death something that can be transcended and defeated?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's like most issues, there's two sides to this coin. I mean, I think there's a beauty in exploring the frontiers of biology. There's a beauty in exploring the edges of health. There's a beauty in, what Brian Johnson is doing, which is to really say what's plausible and possible. And I think there's some aspect of that that's really inspiring, but it also aligns with this kind of very, Americanized view that the goal is just to live long as opposed to live well. Um, and I think that whole person health, from my perspective, is yes about optimal physical health, but it's also about optimal mental, emotional, and even spiritual health, whatever that might mean to somebody. And to kind of provide the counter perspective again, in Tibetan Buddhism, death is celebrated. Death is the primary teacher. The many, if not most, of the meditative practices in advanced Tibetan Buddhism is a deep investigation of dying as a way of learning how to live, as a way of letting go of the grip of attachment of self and ego and body and biology, as a way of getting out of the shackles of the like myopic perspective that my sole objective on the planet is to glorify myself and live really long. Now, again, these are two very extreme perspectives. One is how do I optimize my epigenome and cellular signaling pathways to stay alive forever, and the other is how do I use my death to teach me to be compassionate and selfless? And I think, again, like most things, there's a confluence in the middle that many people can relate to and connect to, that realizes that both those perspectives in moderation, or in Buddhist terminology, in the middle way between those perspectives, might have a lot of value. But um, just staying alive to stay alive is for me personally not that interesting. There's other things I'm interested in exploring.
The surprising part about Brian Johnson's perspective to me, which I think ties in with your research, is so a lot of people, I think the instinctive response is, well, it's prioritizing quantity over quality, because if your whole life has to be a long medical experiment and you can't eat the foods you love, you give up donuts and drinking and going to your late night parties because you have the 8 o'clock bedtime every night or whenever it is, just, everything is optimized, rigid routine, then you're sacrificing quality. And he says, I thought that was the case initially, but the level of mental clarity and emotional stability that he has in following this rigid routine is better than ever before in this like normal life that he used to live. And that he was shocked to see that, at least in his opinion, it offsets all of those other sacrifices. And his argument is that it's almost like normal people live in this fog where, because you have constantly like these disruptions to routine, or we have these levels of inflammation or disruptions to our sleep or whatever it is, that our level of mindfulness and mental health is way lower than it could be in principle. And we don't even know because we've never gotten there. That's the
And
part
I
that shook
totally
me.
agree with that. I totally agree with that. And it sounds as though that's been an incredibly rewarding and incredibly, enlightening vision and path for him. And I think he's probably living at a state that's exquisite and extraordinary. And he may have the psychological constitution to really have that level of focus and discipline in a way that is optimizing and productive for his mental and physical health. I think what I'm trying to navigate is also the appreciation that I know many people who are on the self-improvement path, whether it's mental or physical improvement, that I think fall into a self-aggression that and a really tight grip, that in and of itself, can be stressful and take some
Mhm.
of the joy out of life, and also have biological, consequences with inflammation and stress physiology. So, um, uh, this Brian Johnson seems inspiring, and he makes me want to go try out his lifestyle. I'm not sure I could do it, but I think my meta point is that, each person has their own path, each person has their own priorities, each person has their own goals, and how do we find our own personal North Star of how we want to live on this planet, and really pursue it in line with this sense that we have more free will over our choices than we probably think, but also do it in a way that has a light touch, that's compassionate, and that's about also the service of others as opposed to just ourselves. And I'm not saying anyone that you mentioned is just serving themselves. I'm just saying I think a broader perspective is important to keep in mind.
Hey, Robin, I know you've done a lot of neuroscience research on how the brain processes reward, and a lot of this is building on the animal research that's looking at a very cellular level, like what is the dopamine response to particular food or some particular environmental reward. But then there's the other more abstract type of reward that we're talking about here, which is like well-being and service to others, this type of moral good, like what the Greeks would call eudaimonia, not just happiness, but something like meaning and fulfillment in life. And I'm wondering what the neuroscience perspective is on that. Is it more serotonin driven? Does it still interact with the classic dopamine reward system? What is actually going on in the brain when we experience that type of fulfillment?
Yeah. So, I think it's important to set the stage, on a bit of the neuroscience of positive emotion and reward. Wonderful work showing that dopamine, particularly in portions of the brain in the subcortex and the midbrain, are really important for the pursuit, and the kind of motivation to pursue rewards in our environment. And this involves, relatively complex circuits that are centered in the middle of the brain, like the ventral striatum, and up into the cortex. And the cortex, often in this situation, is doing fairly complex computations of, should I go for the reward? Should I not go for the reward? Do I want the reward? Do I not want the reward? I mean, these are big decisions that the brain is largely making entirely preconsciously, of what's the effort, what's the benefit, what is it worth it, various things like that. And a lot of this work at the animal work has been done by a wonderful group of neurobiologists, Morton Krinkelspach, Ken Berridge, others, showing that dopamine is very critical for motivational pursuit. The enjoyment of a reward when you receive those rewards might be slightly different neurochemically and may center on the same brain areas, in the striatal portions of the brain or in the cortex, but might actually involve more opioid neurochemistry or endocannabinoids, things that are involved in kind of pleasure responses. And so you raise a very interesting question of, what do these different neural systems look like in the context of different types of rewards? I mean, obviously there's hedonic rewards of, I want this food or this drug or this pleasure or what have you. And then there's more eudaimonic rewards, that was first proposed by Aristotle, which is, I want a sense of value and meaning and purpose and various things like that. In my understanding, and others may disagree with me, is that at the neural level, there's a common neural currency, that we don't have different brain systems that mediate eudaimonic versus hedonic rewards. That actually a wonderful study by a friend and colleague of mine, Aaron Heller, showed that people who were high in eudaimonia actually had a higher, reward-related brain activity in the same spots that you would see people respond to pleasurable or food or primary rewards to. So clearly there's a complex intersection between cortical values and value and moral systems that are mediated by the prefrontal cortex, but they tend to kind of engage the same subcortical reward systems. And they kind of look similar in the brain. And so I think what this work highlights is that, pursuing primary rewards and hedonically meaningful rewards is really important. And similarly, pursuing meaning and value and eudaimonic rewards is also really important. And the pursuit and enjoyment of both of those types of rewards are equally positive for the brain. They both activate midbrain dopamine and midbrain opioid receptors. Obviously, this is a kind of a thin line here, though, where often people will pursue these rewards at extremes in ways that can result in addiction or impulsive behaviors or self-destructive behaviors. And I think that's a very interesting fine line in our lives between, healthy pursuits and then pursuits that can actually turn into be somewhat destructive.
You know the neuroscientist Jonas Kaplan?
Mm-hmm.
I had an interesting podcast conversation with him about this, and we were talking about the neuroscience of narrative. So the first level pass at this is kind of a basic computational neural networks. Everything is all different weights and different levels of signal output, and it's just whichever the strongest one wins. So say there's a donut in front of you. Do you want to eat it because that's going to have some immediate pleasure? Or your brain is also calculating an alternative hypothesis of, well, what's the long-term pleasure that I have for sticking to my diet? And different people are going to weight that phenomenon differently. So let's say the actual sugar, how it influences your taste receptors and the dopamine that you get from that, maybe that's more or less fixed, even though there's going to be individual variation in say your preferences for different types of foods. But controlling for that, let's say there's a fixed immediate response, and then what's more variable is into the future, how do you weight your more abstract goals, like self-discipline, like having a certain body image or whatever else. And then whichever one of those wins out is what produces your behavior, whichever reward signal you weight more strongly. Now that gets very abstract and computational, but the narrative spin on it, which was more philosophical that I liked, is, well, it depends on how compelling your story is that the prefrontal cortex is computing. So if you just only have kind of an abstract, hazy goal of different things that you want that are kind of mutually exclusive. Like you want the tasty reward, but you also want some certain body image, but they don't go together, versus you have a very fleshed out narrative in your head of these are exactly the steps that I need to take. Then you won't just experience the dopamine dip of saying no to the immediate reward, but you can actually respin it in a way that this is a single step towards my end goal. It's almost like you turn it into its own hero's journey.
Oh, I love that. I love what you just said. I totally agree. And I love the reference to Joseph Campbell on the hero's journey,
Mhm.
as we've all been on that cosmogonic cycle where we're down in the underworld and we can't find our way out, right? And what you're saying and what Kaplan clearly is saying here is that if you have a narrative about success and you have a narrative, and what success here doesn't necessarily mean just winning, it means a narrative about the arc of your life journey, that can really help sustain you in these hedonically and motivationally challenging moments where the brain has to make, a decision amongst many different possibilities. Um, and I think that is absolutely so interesting. And in some respects, the ultimate example of the narrative I think we see in religion, where you have people who are abstaining from particular behaviors now with the possibility in their mind of rebirth in a better situation in the Indo-Tibetan tradition or in heaven in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And what an incredible window into the human brain where the mind is making a decision to abstain from a reward now with the potential probabilistic reward in a different life that doesn't even affect this current body. Now, whether somebody is religious or not is kind of doesn't matter in the context of the interesting psychology that goes into that process of just understanding that somebody is abstaining a reward now based on a non-material reward after death. And I think that becomes the ultimate delay discounting paradigm that's very intriguing to study. I also love the way you frame it, though, in the context, and this kind of goes back to some of the earlier people where we were talking of more of the Stoics journey, which is, if somebody is really interested in self-improvement, moments of restraint of, pursuing some primary reward like a donut actually become a celebratory moment because it's the brain's muscle working itself out. And then that becomes reinforcing. And those reinforcement moments become, you know, grist for the mill and fuel for the fire to keep them going in subsequent moments. I mean, I think we see this in people who are fighting addiction and trying to, get free of the grip of their addiction. The celebration of I'm 100 days or I'm 10 years sober becomes a major, major reinforcer. And it just shows you the power of the cortex and the power of narrative in regulating, these kind of old evolutionary biological systems. And that intersection is, I think, super interesting.
Yeah, I was struck by how much overlap there is between this cognitive science reinforcement learning spin
Yeah.
on what's essentially like old philosophical wisdom, positive
Yeah.
psychology, or the types of philosophies that you see in religious cultures across the world. But then it raises this open question of, well, why do some people seem to do that more than others? Like, what's actually going on in the cortex? Is it a learning or memory thing? Like, why do some people treat that sort of value exchange rate, like from immediate to abstract, as more real and can actually devote their whole life philosophy around that, and others just don't do that and is not doing that by choice, and it's more like you have an explicit philosophy that's more centered around immediate reward, or is it more like perhaps that's a default state unless you go through the effort of developing this sort of cortical narrative that changes those weights?
Yeah, I think, again, this type of question is such a complex, question because these types of questions really deal with really complex life decisions and life outcomes. And so clearly one, and we won't solve the answer to this question, now, obviously, this is something that people spend their whole careers on, but one could approach this from many different perspectives. I mean, personality psychologists would say this is largely driven by conscientiousness, which is this kind of big five personality characteristic that accounts for a lot of life outcomes, and has actually been shown to be one of the biggest predictors of positive life outcomes, which is high conscientiousness. But then anyone might say, well, what is conscientiousness and where does that come from? Well, that might come from family, that might come from culture, that might come from genetic predispositions. And how do all of these different levels of analysis confluence together, integrate together in a way that generates that complex outcome? I mean, one little perspective in this big question that we tend to focus on in our work. A lot of our work focuses on the neuroscience of depression. So a fair amount of my work historically and currently looks at these reward circuits in the brain and how they're implicated in risk and the experience of depression. And one of the things that's been proposed is what's called a reward hyposensitivity model of addiction and depression. Now, that's a technical term. Basically, what it's saying is that people who have low motivational, reward activity in their brain for whatever causes tend to seek outside of themselves that which they're not providing to themselves internally. So that people who have decreased activity and ventral striatal processes, reward systems, midbrain dopamine, these kind of motivational circuits are actually, somebody might say, well, no, it's really high activity that would cause somebody to be at risk for addiction. There's some research that suggests that might be the case. But there's also evidence to suggest that people who have really low levels of reward-related brain activity are actually at risk for addiction and depression. And it suggests that to the extent that somebody can actually foster positive emotions and intrinsically kind of positive emotional states in themselves, there's less of a need to seek outside that which they're providing to themselves through psychology or through, biological processes. So again, that's just one small window into a complex point. I think my meta point is that we can approach a question like that from multiple different perspectives, and all of those perspectives may be equally true. But the sum of those equally true perspectives creates a really rich understanding of a complex problem.
We see this as academics, which that whole field kind of grew out of its own monastic tradition in Europe, and it follows this same apprenticeship model where for many years you're doing more of the disciplined grunt work, and then you rise through the ranks. And sometimes I just feel really in it, and I'm not even reflecting on that. And you get caught up in the ideas, and it's exciting, and you're debating at lab meeting. And then other times I take on this more Alan Watts perspective of, not exactly being in the driver's seat, but like this almost looking at yourself from a detached viewpoint. And I'm thinking, what am I doing? I'm staying up late at night in lab. I'm reading about rodent testicles to learn about the biology of testosterone. It's dark, like no one else is here. This is kind of sad. Is this my life? And it's funny how I can go back and forth between those two extremes of, in the moment, there's nothing more exciting to me than learning about that neuroendocrinology and thinking how it feeds into explaining all of our behaviors. And it's like I've got this narrative going on of whatever I'm gleaning from this academic paper is so rewarding that I'm prioritizing it over, going home or doing something more immediately rewarding. And I have this appreciation and respect for that. But other times I take this detached view of, the whole world is going on outside me, and I'm here sitting in a little bunker in this academic bubble in the ivory tower, learning about things that are so technical that you can't communicate to most people. I haven't fully resolved that actually, but it's just interesting to me that both of those extreme perspectives can exist for the same behavior.
Well, I commend you for taking an Alan Watts perspective on those dark moments, which is obviously clearly very Zen of you. Um, I think many, myself included at times, might take a less noble framework and feel maybe a bit more despondent. Um, but to me, what you're saying, it actually ties back to this narrative perspective. I think clearly the most important decision that one can make is what is the North Star that they're pursuing on this planet? What is their internal North Star? And it's going to be unique and different for each person. And ultimately, ideally, that is a value-based North Star, where there's a sense of I'm doing this because I deeply believe in the values of this particular path that I'm on, this particular mission that I'm on. Um, and I think if somebody has that framework, I mean, there's that the cliche statement that if somebody has a why, they can navigate any how or any what. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this work? What is this work about? I feel incredibly privileged to be a part of the science conversation in the world at this point in time. I deeply believe in the values of the Enlightenment. I deeply believe in the values of science and evidence-based health and medicine and perspectives. And, will my own work make a contribution? I don't know, but I know that I feel privileged to be a part of the meta conversation of a value system I deeply believe in. Look at academia is a very, very challenging path. And I will say I mean, it's easy for me to say this as an academic who has a faculty position. And I say this cautiously, but at some level it doesn't get easier because the workload continues, the administrative burden continues. You start to spend less and less time actually doing the spark work that got us involved in this field. But I think if we can hold in the back of our minds the narrative, as you alluded to, the why we're doing this, the North Star, the value, and touch on that as many times as possible throughout the day, it can keep us not only going, but keep us vibrant in this path. The one risk, though, is that somebody holds on to that North Star and doesn't change in response to their changing values or their changing needs or their changing life. And they're just on the hedonic treadmill of academia for their entire life. And I may be a candidate of that. So I think it not only takes having that North Star, but then doing deep reflection and saying, well, what's my North Star this year? What's my North Star this year? And does that actually change in response to different developmental and life stages and life goals? But without a why, I don't know how you do the how in academia because it's tough.
That's a very optimistic place to close.
Well, you're the person who wonderfully tied it to Alan Watts, so I had to be optimistic because he is the ultimate optimist.
Right. Thank you, Robin. I love your optimism and the way that you connect these very technical neurobiological details up to these big philosophical questions about human life and value.
Thank you, Adam, for this remarkable service to the field to put all these interviews out there. I think ultimately these types of contributions are really what reaches the world and affects people both in academia and out of academia. So thank you for all that you're doing.